By the time I noticed how small my life had become, it had already been that way for a while. I was 70 when I started paying attention to the door. Not because I was afraid of anything outside it. I wasn't. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where nothing much happened and nobody asked questions, but the door marked the edge of my days. Everything important happened on one side of it, and almost nothing happened beyond it. I lived alone then, retired, widowed long enough that people had stopped checking in. The house wasn't large, but it felt larger than it needed to be. Rooms I didn't use, chairs no one sat in, sounds that echoed longer than they should have. I had learned to keep my movements contained, as if taking up too much space might remind the house that I was the only one left inside it. My days followed a narrow path. I woke early, made coffee, sat in the same chair near the window, watched the street wake up without me. Cars passed, people left for work. Someone else's life always seemed to be starting while mine stayed exactly where it was. In the evenings, I checked the door before I went to bed. Not because I expected trouble, but because it gave the day a sense of completion. Lock the door, turn off the light, sit for a moment in the quiet. When you live alone long enough, routines stop being habits and start becoming proof that you're still here, that you still matter enough to close things properly. That was when I first noticed the dog. It wasn't dramatic. There was no barking, no movement that caught my eye, just a shape near the bottom of the door when I reached for the lock. I thought it was a shadow at first, or maybe a bag someone had left by mistake. It took a few seconds for my eyes to adjust enough to see that it was an animal. A dog, curled up close to the step, positioned in a way that suggested it had been there for a while. It didn't look up when I opened the door. It didn't flinch or move away. It stayed where it was, head resting on its paws, body angled so its back faced the street and its side faced the door. Medium-sized, mixed breed. The kind of dog you don't assign a story to because it looks like it's had many and none of them stuck. I stood there longer than necessary, the cold air creeping into the house, waiting for it to do something. Beg, move, leave. It didn't. Eventually, I closed the door again and turned the lock, telling myself it belonged to someone nearby and would be gone by morning. It wasn't. The next evening, it was there again. Same spot, same posture, quiet, patient. I noticed then that it wasn't sleeping deeply. Its ears shifted slightly when I moved inside the house, tracking my steps through the wood. It knew I was there. It just didn't demand anything from me. I didn't feed it. Not at first. I didn't speak to it. I didn't open the door again once I'd locked it. I told myself that getting involved was unnecessary, that animals come and go, that this was none of my business. Those are easy things to believe when your life already feels contained enough. But as the nights passed, and the dog kept choosing that exact place to lie down, the door began to mean something different. It wasn't just the boundary between inside and outside anymore. It was the only place where something in my life seemed to be waiting. After the third night, it stopped feeling like coincidence and started feeling like routine, though I would not have admitted that to myself at the time. I told myself I was only noticing because I had nothing else to notice anymore. That when your world becomes small, even ordinary things begin to look important. Still, every evening when I reached the door, there he was, settled into the same patch of concrete, body curled just enough to fit the space, never blocking the entrance, never straying too far from it either. He didn't look up at me when I opened the door to check the lock. He didn't wag his tail or shift his weight or give any sign that my presence mattered to him. That, strangely, was what unsettled me the most. Animals usually want something: food, shelter, attention. This dog wanted none of that, or at least he didn't ask for it. He behaved like someone who had already decided where he belonged and was simply waiting for the world to accept it. During the day, I didn't see him at all. The street was empty when I checked in the mornings, and by afternoon there was no sign that anything had been there overnight. It was only when the light began to fade, when the day started folding itself away, that he appeared again, quietly reclaiming his place, as if he had never left. On the fourth night, it rained. A steady, cold rain that soaked through coats and settled into the bones. I stood at the window longer than usual, watching the water run down the glass, and felt a small irritation rise in me. Not at the dog, but at the thought that he might be out there, unmoving, for no reason at all. I opened the door just enough to see him clearly, expecting him to bolt or flinch at the sudden light. He didn't. He simply shifted his head slightly, acknowledging the change without reacting to it. His fur was damp along the edges, darkened by the rain, but he showed no sign of distress. That was the night I put a bowl of water outside. I told myself it was practical, not kindness. Anyone would do the same. I set it down quietly and closed the door again, not waiting to see if he noticed. When I checked later, the bowl was empty. The dog was still there. Something about that stayed with me longer than it should have. Over the next few nights, I added food. Not much, leftovers at first, then proper food, once I found myself buying it without admitting why. The dog accepted it the same way he accepted everything else, without urgency, without gratitude, without expectation. He never tried to follow me inside, never tested the door, never crossed the line between outside and in. He remained positioned near the threshold, close enough to hear, close enough to know, but far enough that it felt like a choice rather than a claim. I began to notice things I hadn't before. How he adjusted his position depending on the weather, angling his body to block the wind. How he lifted his head whenever I stood up inside the house, even if I didn't go near the door. How he woke before I did, as if anticipating movement rather than responding to it. None of it felt dramatic, none of it felt comforting either. It simply felt deliberate. I didn't name him. Naming makes things heavier, and I wasn't ready to carry anything else. I told myself this was temporary, that strays move on, that routines break as easily as they form. But as the weeks passed and the dog continued to choose the same place, night after night, I began to understand that whatever this was, it wasn't about shelter or food. It was about staying. And in a life where everything else had quietly moved on without me, that presence, silent, undemanding, consistent, began to feel more solid than anything I had left. By the second week, I stopped wondering if he would be there. That was the change. Not that the dog stayed, but that my mind made room for him without asking permission. I found myself thinking about the door earlier in the evening, listening for sounds I hadn't realized I was listening for. When the light outside softened and the street grew quiet, I expected him the way you expect night to follow evening. It wasn't hope. It wasn't attachment. It was acceptance. The night settled into a pattern that felt almost careful. I ate my dinner slowly, washed the same plate, dried it with the same towel. Before turning off the lights, I checked the door, not to lock it. I had already done that. But to confirm what I already knew. The dog lay in his usual place, body curled, head angled toward the house, ears alert enough to register my movement through the wood. He never looked startled. He simply acknowledged me by being awake. Some nights, I stood there longer than necessary, not watching him exactly, but allowing the moment to exist. The street lamp down the road cast a pale wash of light that didn't quite reach the door, leaving him half in shadow, half in clarity. Cars passed occasionally, their headlights sliding across the pavement and disappearing again. He didn't react to them. He reacted to me. When I shifted my weight inside, his head lifted. When I stepped away, it lowered again. That quiet awareness began to feel strangely grounding, like a second heartbeat somewhere nearby. I noticed that he never slept deeply. Even when his eyes were closed, his body remained arranged for listening. If I coughed, he stirred. If I moved a chair, he adjusted. It wasn't nervousness. It was attention. The difference matters. Nervousness scatters. Attention stays. I began leaving the porch light on. Not for him. That's what I told myself, but because it made the entryway easier to see, I told myself it was practical, but on the nights I forgot, I noticed the absence immediately and went back to turn it on, unsettled until the small circle of light returned. The dog seemed indifferent to it. He didn't move closer or farther. He simply occupied the space it revealed. During the day, my life remained unchanged. The chair, the window, the same hours folding into one another. But the nights had taken on weight. They were no longer something to get through. They were something that belonged to a pattern, one I shared, even if we never crossed paths directly. Once late in the evening, I heard a soft sound outside the door. Not a bark, not a scratch, just the subtle shift of weight. I froze, hand on the light switch, waiting. The sound didn't repeat. Whatever adjustment he had made was finished. I realized then how closely I was listening, how quickly my attention had aligned itself with something beyond my own thoughts. I still didn't speak to him. I didn't open the door again. I didn't invite him in. Boundaries remained where they were. But boundaries don't disappear just because they soften. They become quieter instead. By then, the dog was no longer just a presence outside my door. He was part of how the night ended. And without realizing it, I had begun measuring my days, not by what happened inside the house, but by the certainty that when the light faded and the door closed, something would be there, waiting, listening, staying. Even when nothing else in my life had chosen to do the same, the first thing that changed wasn't the nights, it was me. At first, it was easy to dismiss. I woke up more tired than usual, the kind of tired that sits behind your eyes and doesn't leave after coffee. My hands shook slightly when I poured the water, just enough that I noticed it and then pretended not to. I moved slower, not because I had to, but because my body seemed to suggest it before I asked. These things happen when you're old. That's what I told myself. Age explains a lot if you let it. Some afternoons I felt lightheaded when I stood up too quickly. The room would tilt for a second, then settle again, and I would wait it out, one hand resting on the table until everything felt solid. I never considered sitting down permanently. I never considered calling anyone. I had learned over the years that small discomforts don't require witnesses. The dog noticed. I didn't connect it at first. I only became aware that his position had changed. Instead of lying slightly off to the side of the door, he began settling closer to the center, directly in front of it. Not blocking it completely, just enough that if I were to open the door, I would have to acknowledge him. He lifted his head more often now, tracking my movements inside with greater precision. When I crossed the room, he shifted. When I paused, he paused. It felt less like coincidence and more like adjustment. One evening, when I reached for my coat to step outside and take the trash out, he rose abruptly for the first time since I had known him. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He simply stood, body tense, eyes fixed on the door. I hesitated, my hand still gripping the fabric, unsure why I had stopped. After a moment, I told myself I was being foolish and stepped closer anyway. He moved with me, aligning himself directly in front of the door, close enough that I could hear his breathing through the wood. I remember feeling irritated then, not angry, irritated, as if something was interrupting a plan that didn't matter very much. I told him to move, quietly, the way you speak when you don't expect an answer. He didn't. Eventually I stepped back, my balance wavering just enough that I felt it. I waited for the dizziness to pass, then hung the coat back up. The dog settled down again, returning to his place without ceremony. After that, small things began to stack up. My chest felt tight more often than it should have. I lost my appetite without noticing when it happened. Walking the length of the house left me short of breath, and I found myself sitting down more frequently, telling myself I was conserving energy. Nights came faster, days felt heavier. Still, I said nothing. To whom would I say it? Outside, the dog's behavior shifted again. He whined softly sometimes, not enough to draw attention from the street, just enough to be heard if you were listening for it. He woke earlier in the evenings, alert before I moved, as if anticipating something I hadn't yet decided to do. There was no panic in him, no fear, only insistence. I ignored it all. I told myself animals react to changes in weather. I told myself routine makes creatures sensitive to disruption. I told myself I was projecting meaning where there was none. Those explanations felt safer than admitting that something inside me was quietly failing, and that the only thing responding to it was a dog I had never invited into my life. By the time I understood that my body was no longer asking for attention, but demanding it, the nights had already changed their tone. The door no longer felt like a boundary, it felt like a warning. And the dog, lying just outside it, seemed to understand that long before I did. The night it happened felt no different from the ones before it, and that is what troubles me now when I think back on it. There was no warning that made sense in the moment, no sudden pain that announced itself clearly enough to be respected. I finished my dinner slowly, more out of habit than hunger, and sat in my chair longer than usual, staring at the darkened window while the hours slipped past without asking anything of me. When I stood up, the room swayed slightly, just enough to make me pause, and I waited it out the way I always did, one hand braced against the table until the floor steadied beneath my feet. I told myself it had passed. I told myself it always does. I turned off the lights one by one, moving carefully, aware of my own breathing in a way I hadn't been before, each breath a little shallower than the last. I remember reaching the hallway and feeling a sudden heaviness settle into my chest, not sharp, not dramatic, just a weight that made my legs feel unreliable, as if they had forgotten how to hold me. I don't remember falling so much as realizing I was already on the floor. The distance between standing and lying down vanished, replaced by the cold press of the tiles against my side, and the strange quiet that comes when your body decides something for you. I tried to move. I tried to call out. My mouth opened, but no sound followed, and the effort left me dizzy, my vision narrowing at the edges as if the room was slowly pulling away from me. The door was only a few steps away, close enough that I could see the faint line of light beneath it, the same door I had checked every night for weeks now, the same door that marked the end of my days. I thought about reaching it, about dragging myself forward inch by inch, but the thought felt larger than the strength I had left. That was when the dog barked. It cut through the silence sharply, startling in its suddenness because I had never heard it before, not once. The sound came again, louder this time, followed by the scrape of claws against the wood. I lay there, half aware, the barking rising and falling in uneven bursts, echoing through the house in a way that felt urgent and wrong. Somewhere in my fading awareness, I realized that I hadn't opened the door that night. I hadn't checked the lock. I hadn't confirmed the ending of the day. For the first time since the dog had appeared, the routine was broken, and he knew it. The barking didn't stop. It changed instead, growing more insistent, more relentless, as if repetition itself were the message. I heard footsteps outside at some point, distant at first, then closer. A voice called out, muffled by the door. The barking surged again, louder than before, and then there were more voices, overlapping, confused, urgent. Light flooded the hallway as the door opened, too bright, too sudden, and hands reached for me. Voices saying my name even though I didn't remember telling anyone what it was. The last clear thing I remember before everything went dark was the sound of the dog still barking outside, refusing to move from the doorway even as they stepped around him to reach me. He stayed there, guarding the only boundary that still mattered, until the house filled with strangers and I was no longer alone on the floor. And then, finally, the noise faded. Not because he stopped, but because I did. When I woke up, the light felt wrong, not harsh, not painful, just unfamiliar. It came from above and from the sides, steady and colorless, without the softness of a window. For a few seconds I didn't know where I was or why my body felt so heavy, as if it had been arranged carefully by someone else. My mouth was dry, my chest ached in a dull, distant way. When I tried to move, something tugged gently at my arm, reminding me that I was no longer alone with myself. A nurse noticed my eyes open and spoke my name quietly, as if volume might undo whatever fragile balance had brought me back. She told me to stay still. She told me I was safe. Those words meant very little at the time. Safety is hard to measure when you've just learned how easily it can disappear. Later, a doctor stood beside the bed and explained things slowly, without urgency, as though the danger belonged to the past and no longer required emotion. My heart, he said, had struggled. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily, the way things fail when they've been working too hard for too long without complaint. He told me that if help had arrived any later, the outcome would have been different. He didn't say how different. He didn't need to. I listened without interrupting. I had grown used to listening. It wasn't until the next day that someone told me about the dog. A neighbor had been walking past late that night when the barking caught his attention. He said it wasn't normal barking, not the kind that fades or pauses, but something relentless, something that refused to be ignored. When he came closer, he saw the dog at my door, scratching and barking, then stopping just long enough to listen before starting again. The neighbor said he knocked first. When there was no answer and the dog didn't move, he called for help. I closed my eyes when he finished telling me that, not because I was overwhelmed, but because the picture formed too clearly. The dog lying outside the door night after night. The one night I didn't open it. The one night I didn't complete the routine. I understood then why the barking had been so different, why it hadn't sounded like noise but like insistence. The dog hadn't been afraid. He had been certain. I stayed in the hospital for several days after that. Time moved in small, measured pieces: meals, medication, brief walks down sterile hallways with someone watching to make sure I didn't drift. My body felt weaker than I remembered, but clearer, as if something heavy had been lifted and replaced with caution. People came and went. They asked questions. They explained instructions. They told me what to watch for. No one mentioned the dog again. When I was finally discharged, the nurse handed me my belongings and wished me well in a voice that suggested she did not expect to see me again. I walked out slowly, my steps careful, my attention fixed on the ground as if the world might tilt without warning. The air outside felt colder than it should have, sharper against my face, and I drew my coat tighter without thinking. On the ride home, I stared out the window, not watching the road, but the spaces between things, the gaps where something might be waiting. I didn't know what I expected to find when I returned to the house, but as the car turned onto my street, one thought pressed itself quietly into my mind, heavier than all the others. I had survived the night, and I had not done it alone. I stood in front of the house for a moment before going in, the way you do when you're not sure whether something will still recognize you. It looked the same as it always had. Same steps, same door, same quiet street. Nothing in the place suggested that anything extraordinary had happened there, and that unsettled me more than I expected. I unlocked the door slowly, half aware of my own breathing, listening for a sound I didn't know how to describe, but would have recognized immediately if I heard it. When I opened it, the dog was there. He wasn't lying down this time. He sat upright, close to the door but not blocking it, body still, eyes fixed on me with an attention that felt steady rather than excited. There was no barking, no movement toward me, just that same quiet presence I had grown used to over the weeks, now positioned on the other side of the threshold. I stood there holding the door open, my hand resting against the wood, unsure of what came next. For the first time since he had appeared, The distance between us felt like a choice I was expected to make. I stepped back. That was all it took. He rose and entered the house without hesitation, padding past me as if he had always known this would happen, as if the nights outside had not been waiting but preparing. He didn't explore. He didn't wander through the rooms or sniff the furniture. He walked directly to the spot just inside the door and lay down, arranging himself the same way he always had, only now the floor beneath him was warm and the air was still. The door closed behind us with a soft sound that did not feel final. I sat down in my chair and watched him for a long time. He didn't look back. He didn't seek approval. His job, whatever it had been, seemed finished, and now he rested with the calm of something that had done exactly what it came to do. I felt an unfamiliar tightness in my chest then, not pain, not fear, something closer to recognition. I realized that all those nights he hadn't been guarding the house. He had been guarding the pause between my days, the thin line where routine could fail without being noticed. Life after that adjusted itself slowly. I moved with more care. I rested when my body asked instead of arguing with it. The dog followed me at a distance, never underfoot, never demanding attention. At night, he returned to his place near the door. Inside now, his back to the world, his side toward me. The door still mattered, but it no longer felt like the only thing holding my life together. Sometimes, late in the evening, I would catch him lifting his head when my breathing changed, or when I shifted in my chair. He noticed what I still struggled to admit. That awareness didn't frighten me anymore. It steadied me. I never named him. Names suggest ownership, and that didn't feel right. He wasn't mine in the way possessions are. He was something that had arrived when it was needed and stayed long enough to make sure I would remain. That felt like a debt I couldn't repay with a word. On quiet nights, when the house settled into its familiar sounds, I would sit near the door a little longer than necessary, listening to the world beyond it and to the steady breathing beside me. For the first time in a long while, the silence did not feel like abandonment. It felt like company. Life did not change all at once after that. There was no sudden gratitude, no dramatic sense of being given a second chance. It unfolded the way real life always does, quietly, without asking for permission. The mornings returned first. I woke earlier than I needed to, not from anxiety, but from awareness. My body spoke more clearly now, and I listened. I made my coffee slowly. I sat in my chair and let the day arrive instead of rushing toward it. The dog stayed near the door, inside, exactly where he had chosen to rest, his presence steady and unremarkable in a way that made it feel permanent. People asked questions when they learned what had happened. Neighbors I barely knew nodded a little longer when they passed. Someone mentioned how lucky I was. I didn't correct them. Luck suggests randomness, and nothing about that night felt random anymore. What saved me was not chance, but attention, given quietly without instruction, by something that had decided I was worth waiting for. The dog never became affectionate in the way people expect. He didn't seek my hands or press himself against my legs. He didn't perform loyalty. He simply stayed. When I moved, he noticed. When I sat, he rested. When the house fell silent at night, his breathing filled the space just enough to remind me that silence doesn't have to mean absence. I thought often about the door, not as a symbol, not as a lesson, just as a fact. For weeks, it had been the last thing I touched before sleep, and the first thing something else paid attention to when I failed to. I understood now how narrow the line is between routine and disappearance. How easily a life can slip into the quiet space where no one is listening anymore. The dog continued to sleep by the door long after he no longer needed to. Habit, perhaps, or memory. I didn't move him. Some roles don't end just because the danger passes. They settle into something gentler. On certain evenings, when the house felt too still, I would sit nearby and rest my hand on the floor, close enough that he could feel me without being touched. That was enough. We shared the space without asking anything from it. I never told anyone the full story the way it happened, not because it was secret, but because it didn't belong to explanation. It belonged to the small, quiet truth that had revealed itself when everything else failed, that being seen even once can be enough to keep you here. The dog slept, the door stayed closed, and I remained. That was all.